Who do you think of when it comes to educational leaders who stand out for their ideation, collaboration, innovation, and drive? I bet that Jeff Utecht is at the top of your list, whether you went to one of his sessions at a conference or enjoyed his company at your school. From being one of the first educational bloggers, first international educational podcasters, to helping start the Learning 2.0 conference, to co-creating the COETAIL network of professional learning groups, to more recently, co-creating the Shifting Schools consultancy company, Jeff has been a juggernaut of dynamic energy over the past 2 decades. In this episode, we discuss consultancy services and professional learning, pedagogy, responses to the pandemic, and of course, Jeff's musings going forward. It was a special treat for me to once again be behind the mic with my old podcasting partner. And now, here's Jeff.
Hi, and welcome to Educators Going Global. Today I'm so excited because we have a podcasting phenom with us, Jeff Utecht. Jeff, welcome. Tell us about where you are and what's going on with you.
Thanks for having me, Audrey. It's great to be here. I am currently in Seattle, Washington, where it is currently not snowing, but it's not raining. So, in Seattle, we'll take it as long as it's not
That's
raining.
Good weather.
So,
yeah,
it's good. So yeah, we're doing well. Thanks for having me.
Good. Thank you for being here. So one thing that we ask our guests to do is to share a going global story. Have you got one for us today?
Sure. I can share. I mean, you know how it is being an international educator. You've got more stories than anybody ever wants to hear. But I think the going global story, for those of you that don't know, as I was overseas for 10 years, we were 3 years in Saudi Arabia. I say we, my wife was a school counselor. We did this together. I was a 4th grade teacher when we left. But we were 3 years in Saudi Arabia, 3 years in Shanghai, China, and 4 years in Bangkok. And what had happened was in 2012, we moved back here to Seattle and I started consulting full time, but I was still known and my network was in international schools. And so I was consulting full time out of Seattle, but I was still traveling all over the world, consulting with international schools, doing international conferences. And because nobody really knew me back here in the United States or on the stateside. And so in 2000, I think it was 2014, I ended up traveling over 250,000 miles that year.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, more than I wanted to. But there was at one point, I did 2 around the world trips. But at one point, many people don't know this, but here in the US, you can actually get 2 passports if you have a reason to have 2 passports. So you have to go through the passport, you go through the passport agency and you have to show them that you need 2 passports. And so I had to get 2 passports because I always had one going off and getting a visa and the other one I was traveling with. And luckily for me, incredible wife who is getting visas for me and making sure passports are coming and going and that I had the right passport at the airport when I needed it. But there was one of the trips that I had to, because of just the passport situation, I had to fly from, I believe I was in Bangkok. I had to fly all the way back to the Seattle. I spent less than 12 hours on the ground. My wife met me. I got back into the United States and we met at a Denny's, if people know what Denny's is, met at a restaurant, swapped out passports, and clean clothes and back to the airport and off to Russia. So it was just an incredible time period. I was so honored to be able to do that for a year. It was tiring. I don't ever need to travel 250,000 miles in a single year again. But it was an incredible, incredible time to see the world and meet so many amazing educators and so many different international schools and conferences and stuff. But yeah, that was a crazy time for sure.
What an opportunity. What a whirlwind, though.
Well, and Jeff, you really hustled and you made a name for yourself and you were so sought after. And And in my mind, you were bigger than life, and that connects to a little story. You probably don't remember this, but I was in New Orleans at the ISTE conference a long time ago. And I remember checking in with you. To our listeners, Jeff and I used to do a podcast together. And I remember checking in, you said you weren't going to make it. And so I arrived and walked into the big hall, and there was this huge cutout of a very handsome man. It must have been 12 feet tall. And I took a picture and I went to my laptop and I emailed Jeff. And I think I just put the simple line and I said, Jeff, I thought you were not coming to New Orleans. So that was quite a moment. You had made your name with ISTE, that's for sure. All right. Well, let's, much like the old days with the Shifting Our School podcast, we start with a guiding question. And our guiding question is, where do you see educational consultancy and professional and personal learning going in the near term?
It's a really good question. I think there's a lot of things that are happening right now in education. I mean, there's a lot of things happening just in society at large. And as we all know, education I think for the better, but, education kind of trails a little bit about where trends are heading in society. And I think we're seeing that with consultancy. We're seeing that with this idea of professional development and professional learning. We're in a pause right now, and maybe that's where we're supposed to be after just incredible years of being insanely trying to do education in a different way overnight. And in some places, places like China, where we're still trying to figure out how do we do this and what's the best way to do this, and being very innovative. I love right now talking to some of my educational colleagues who are in China, who are still in it, right? They're still in these spaces and still learning on behalf of all of us on how do you really teach a kindergartner over Zoom, for lack of a better analogy. It's some of us were thrown into it for small bits of time or for a year, but we're going on 2-3 years now of trying to do this. And so there's just so much that I think we've learned when it comes to educating and thinking about kids. So from the consultancy side of things, I think, consultants are still out there. They're still needed. It's changed. My focus was educational technology for a long time. I am pivoting into the world of engagement, as we are seeing that we're struggling with engaging a generation, and especially coming out of the pandemic where kids were at home or kids weren't around other kids. And this idea of engaging is an interesting one. It's something we're focused on here in the US, and I'm getting a lot inquiries internationally as well of how do you engage a generation that spent a year or longer at home in solitude to be back in a classroom with their colleagues. So I think that's one side of things. The other part of your question around this idea of professional development versus professional learning, I think we're going to see a lot of different ways that professional learning impacts the educational world. And if you look at the definition of those two, right? Professional development is development that is done to me. Somebody else decides it. So the school brings in a consultant. The school says, we're all going to learn this. That's professional development. Versus this idea of professional learning is I taking control of that. And we have all these new avenues. And this is the thing I love, David. You and I have been in this, and Audrey, you too. We've been in this long enough as ed tech coaches and the ed tech roles we had. One of the things I love is none of the technology we're using today was created because of the pandemic.
Right.
It was all just sitting here. It was all waiting to be used. Nobody invented Zoom the day the pandemic started. Nobody invented Google Meets or Google Classroom or Canvas or name your LMS that you ended up using. It was just sitting there. It was waiting for us. And the pandemic, for better or for worse, forced us into some of these places. And now we're rethinking, okay, well, what does it mean? Like a professional learning network, if I want to engage in professional learning, I can go out and learn from anybody. There are free webinars happening all over Zoom. There are free online courses that you can take because you want something very specific for you. And I think that's going to be quite the change. What I don't think is caught up is how does an educational institution, say a school, or in my case, a state, say, hey, You went and listened to 5 podcasts. You filled out or wrote 4 blog posts. That's worth 1 credit, or that's worth 3 credits, or that is worth learning. I think we're missing that piece from a standard standpoint, but we know the avenues are there. We know it can be done. And so I think we're wrestling with this idea of how do we really transition to professional development that is done to me, where it's the district's job or it's the school's job to make sure that I keep developing as an educator, to this world of professional learning where it's my responsibility to go out and do the learning that I feel I need. And I think we're just in a transition right now with that.
Well, I think those are both fantastic directions to be heading in.
In a connection to that, Jeff, you were on John Mickton, Dan Taylor's podcast many, many months ago. And it was a great episode. In many ways, it was a repeat of one that you and I did on the Ed Tech, where we discussed what you're talking about. We use the term personalized. How do you personalize that learning? And like you were saying, I'm going to read these blog posts, I'm going to listen to these podcasts, I'm going to read this book. And one of the points that we brought up that I thought was so interesting is the kind of lateral thinking and connection making to say, what do we like to learn personally? And I remember you were talking about, oh, you might like Thai cooking, or you might like hiking, or different things. That aspect of learning, when you're bringing in the different conduits of information, often they mix together, right? And from that, you get new ideas that you can apply on your professional side and possibly on your personal side as well. So I think that personalized learning and bringing, by you having control, as you're saying, but also bringing in that personal learning you just do for your own personal growth.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, we see a lot of people in whatever your hobby is, people spend all kinds of time, I mean, my wife's a perfect example. My wife loves to cook, and I can't tell you how many hours she spends looking up recipes and looking up techniques and trying new things. And I mean, there's so much personal learning happening there, but it spills over. She loves to design spaces now. She runs our real estate business, and she loves to design and she loves to create. And there's so much overlap in how those two things have gone together that, we've got to understand we live in an incredible time in an incredible world. And how are we taking advantage of that on both our personal and our professional end of our lives?
So something that, kind of just popped in my head as you were sharing both of those ideas was, to what extent, and, maybe this could turn into a question. I don't know if you have an answer for it or not, but to what extent could we extend this idea of personal learning if we could figure out a way to measure what was going on? And like you said, with teachers, if we could do that same thing and kind of roll that into this idea of engaging kids and say, you can have a personal learning, situation going on as kids, as long as we could figure out how to measure their progress and what they were learning, theoretically, that would automatically be more engaging. Have you gone in that route at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's what we do over at Shifting Schools. At Shifting Schools, we call them pathways. And we call them pathways because one of the first things we know when it comes to engagement, and regardless of age, if you want engagement, you need to give choice. One of the ways you get ownership in learning and you get engagement is you give learners choice. And that choice in today's world is not just choice in read 3 articles. The choice has to be, here's an article to read, or maybe you're a research brain. Here's research to read, but maybe you're also an audio video brain. So here's a video you can watch. Here's a podcast you can listen to. And your goal is not to watch all 3 or 4 or read all 3 or 4. Your goal is to choose one. And there's choice in that. And when we are given choice, we see engagement. And that goes for learners of all ages. So over at Shifting Schools, we create what we call learning pathways. And in these learning pathways, there's an instructional video, which is not going away. I'm sorry to all the educators that are sick and tired of making instructional videos. They are best practice in 2022 and beyond. They're not going to go away. But we have these instructional videos that kind of walk you through something to learn. You then have choices on going deeper. Do you want to watch a video? Do you want to go listen to a couple podcasts? Do you want to read research because you don't believe what we're telling you? You get to choose that. But the best part is right the next slide, because they're built in slide decks. They're built in Google Slides. The next slide is a reflection slide. So you do the learning, and then right inside the exact same slide deck, there's a reflection prompt. And we give you a prompt. We give you a protocol. We're really big over at Shifting Schools. You can download more protocols than you'll ever need as a teacher at shiftingschools.com. Over 60 free PDFs. Each one has a minimum of 5 in it. But we have all these protocols that are basically reflective. It's reflective practice. You just learned something, reflect and tie it to what you already know or you're already doing. And then you go learn the next step, reflect on it. And they work with adults, but they also work with students. And so we've created them because we are a professional learning company. We've created them for teachers, but we've created them in a way that we hope that as you're going through it as a teacher, you can also look at this and say, you know what, I could recreate this for my students. And instead of having students, and this is one of the things we found during the pandemic, and we're still finding today, is this disconnect between doing work and then having to go turn something in, right? I have to turn in, I have to turn in this Word document for this teacher, and this teacher wants it in Google. And, this teacher's, that shuts off at midnight, and that teacher, it's late if it's turned in at 10 p.m. And these kids are trying to figure out all of these different systems and having to upload this document and upload that document. And the documents aren't tied together. And my research is over here, and my pre-write's over there. And it just gets really all over the place. In a pathway, it's one Google slide deck or PowerPoint, doesn't matter. It's one slide deck. And the learning and the reflection are in the same slide deck. There's just one thing that kids have to go through. It's taking the old idea of I have a textbook and I have a separate notebook, but in a digital world, we just have one thing. It's both my textbook and my notebook. And it's little adjustments like that lead to, I think, very impactful ways of looking at learning differently. One of the things that I think we're going to see in the future, and what the future of education looks like, is this idea of, we used to call it blended learning. We're moving into a world of a high flex learning environment. And if you haven't started researching this idea of high flex, I strongly encourage you to go out and do some research around the idea of a high flexed classroom, high flex being hybrid and flexible. And we're going to be in this system where we're going to be creating high flex learning environments, both for professional learning situations, but also for our students. The one caveat I will say with that is, when you are going out and you are doing your own research around high flex classrooms, make sure that you are keeping in the back of your head, K-12 educators, that most of the research that you're going to be finding is done at universities. And the same thing that works at universities, when you have a paying student who has to show up, doesn't always work in our K-12 classrooms. And so some of the work and research that we've been doing over at Shifting Schools is looking at, how do you take high flex, this idea of a high flex classroom, and what the research shows works at the university level. What parts of that actually do work in K-12 and what parts don't work in K-12? For example, thinking that you can zoom in a second grader who is sitting at home on the couch while his 13 or 14 other classmates are teaching in person, and you're just going to be watching other kids learn as a second grader, is not good pedagogy. And so there's parts of this where we're transitioning, we're taking pieces of it, but this idea of a high flex classroom that is both hybrid and flexible and kids can learn anywhere is going to really be, I think, a trademark of future ready schools in the future.
And so, Jeff, it sounds like you and Tricia and your team, you're just being very responsive. That's what instructional technologists do. So that's interesting that you've taken the blended learning, and it sounds like modular learning, and the whole idea of personalizing, that the kids are going to have choice, and they, as you're saying, they can put these pathways together. That seems like something that would be very helpful for schools. So I guess that's a big outreach topic for you right now.
Yeah, it is. And, the best part is, and you're both going to love this, where we're getting a lot of our research from and where we're seeing both there was already traction and we're seeing the fastest adoption is in here in America, what we call alternative high schools. These are high schools that are usually set up where kids either are behind credits or they, the traditional school, the one district I'm working with calls them, the big box school, didn't work for these kids. And so we set up alternative high schools that are for different kids that learn differently. And they've been doing this a long time because they have students who maybe show up for a week and then don't show up for 2 weeks for whatever reason, because they're living life differently. And they have been adjusting to this idea of being highly flexible ever before the pandemic started. And so we're getting a lot of our learning from alternative high schools that have been doing things differently and continue to be able to innovate faster with students in different situations, and bringing that into quote unquote our big box high schools, traditional classrooms, and looking at how learning works in a different way. So it's been really cool to be able to see how a lot of that research and some of the pedagogical approaches that have been used in alternative schools are now making their way and impacting mainstream learning.
Well, it's very energizing listening to you. And right now I'm going to recommend people listening to this that they should definitely also follow Shifting Schools, because you're going to get a lot of these types of ideas out there. So that's awesome. So when a school does contact you and says, we would like some consulting happening, what type of areas do they get into? Is it the engagement? Is it a teacher personal learning network? Is there more to it? What are the types of things that schools are looking for, both in the States and internationally?
Yeah. So right now, I think there's kind of two things that we're seeing a lot of. I myself am a Google certified partner. And so we've got a lot of, if you are a Google workspace school, we've got a lot of different pathways. Again, I'll go back to these pathways that we've created around, learning the different parts of the Google tools. If you're moving or transitioning to a Google tools, or you're still finding that teachers need some support there. Our number one pathway right now is Gmail. A lot of people have been using Gmail for a long time, but Gmail's changed a lot. And that's probably our number one pathway at the moment, is setting up Gmail for success as an educator. And it can also be used for students, because students need to learn to use email, as my freshman goddaughter is quickly finding out at university. And so, there's a lot of them that are kind of tech-based that way that we're still seeing. But really, the other thing we're seeing is around this idea of engagement. And as everybody is focused on, as we should be, is social and emotional learning. And so a lot of our free resources over at Shifting Schools, again, if you go to shiftingschools.com, it says free resources at the top. You can start downloading the PDFs all day. My colleague, Tricia Freeman, just does an incredible job. She was an international educator as well, now lives in Ontario, Canada. She creates these amazing free guides that has everything. Like I'm looking at one right now that's 5 temperature checks. That is a social emotional piece before you get into an engagement. We are seeing a lot of schools reach out to us around helping to scaffold the idea of collaboration, that putting students into collaborative groups. Students don't know how to collaborate. And so there's a lot of resources around building collaboration, or teaching the skills of collaboration, or how do you set up your classroom so that your students are ready to collaborate. So we've got a lot of resources around that. We're really big into reflective protocols and helping students to be reflective and to creating structure. We love to create structures and scaffolding inside our classrooms. And so that's a lot of what we're talking about, but mostly it's focused around this idea of engagement. How do we get kids to engage? And, for better or for worse, Generation Alpha, who's in our schools now, or Generation Z is the end of them, but Generation Alpha for most of us, they are a media first generation. And so we're looking at ways, again, how are we using video? How are we using audio? Podcast PD is something that's becoming huge. Much like you guys in your podcast, we've got our own podcast. We've got lists of podcasts. So if you're looking for a list of podcasts that's just authors of books that we've interviewed, or we did a whole mini series around journalists, and where we got to talk journalists from, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the San Francisco Chronicle about what is their job, what skills do they use on a daily basis. So we've got a lot of those kind of resources as well to kind of support teachers and kids. And being our tagline, my personal tagline, is how do we prepare students for their future and not our past? And that's what we're focused on, is looking at how do we prepare this next generation for the future of work. That, here in America, we're looking at probably 50% are going to be working from home. That's not how it was 3 years ago.
Right.
Internationally, you can live anywhere. You can maybe go to school anywhere. What's this going to do for international schools when, my family's going to move to Hong Kong, but my student isn't going to go to the international school in Hong Kong. They're going to go to the international, back to their public school in whatever country they came from, because we can do that now. And so I think there's just a lot of those kind of resources and things we've been thinking about over at Shifting School.
Well, just to share a personal story about how that kind of thinking affected my family. My son self-taught how to be a web developer, and that's what he's doing now, and he's crushing it. And he basically just took a year and a lot of YouTubes, a lot of Googling, and taught himself to use React, and is now a web developer, and high paying job and all this wonderful stuff. So it's definitely the wave of the future.
Yeah.
Oh, and he's working from home, by the way, too.
Of course. Yeah. Right. And that's just it. It's just going to be different for this generation. And we, as K-12 institutions, need to be thinking about how do we make sure we're opening up lanes for kids, and we're not in the same mindset of forcing kids into one or two outcomes. It's literally college, career, life. And right now, if you decide to go through, your 12 or 13 years and then go watch some YouTube videos, you too can become a web developer and live anywhere you want and work from home. I mean, that is an avenue for some kids, and we need to make sure that that's out there for them.
Right. And shout out to Kyle, because he, on his own time, has made our whole website, and it rocks.
There you go.
Does Kyle. He is incredible. Holy cow. So, Jeff, you hit on a couple of things there. I just want to comment real quickly. It was always so interesting on the Ed Tech and the Shifting Our School podcast that you would find these niches out there and then figure out ways, what were the needs that need to be met. And you just hit on such a truism about the alternative schools. 30 years ago, getting my counseling degree, got a job in a public alternative school, and they were the best educators I've ever worked with. And they were adaptable. We were taking the kids on the weekends, camping trips, experiential ed, so ahead of the curve in so many ways. So that's really something that you're tapping in there, and one, drawing on how they do things, but you're also looking at these students, right, that mom loses her job. They've got to move from one apartment to another, so that child's not going to school for a week. So that sounds really great. And then the other part, just the scaffolding in the building. I've been to your site many times. That it's a toolbox to go in there and find these tools that you adapt for your needs. So that's really huge. And then I think the third thing is, we talk about the deficit, the learning deficit due to the pandemic. And it's the full spectrum, and of course, this social emotional learning and general wellness. But these kids have lost that time to have face-to-face collaboration. So they need that help right now. And as you're pointing out, that is one of the, going back 20 years, the 21st century skills was collaboration and teamwork. So that sounds like your team, you all are offering so much. Now, to shift a little bit, we want to paint the picture a little bit. So let's say we've got some listeners right now and they're thinking about going overseas. Could you paint the picture of what they might experience as part of their, it might be PD, professional development, as you were talking about, and it might be professional learning, personal learning. What's something that might be different than they would get in a normal US or Canadian public school? How would it be different?
Well, that's a great question. And I think for me and for my friends who are still, international educators, the thing that I think really it comes down to is the community that you get at an international school, the growth professionally that you get for a couple different reasons. One, most of the time, in most cases, your class size is going to be way less. than they are in a public school here in the US anyway. You are working with other colleagues who have made these same choices you have made and are just some of the most incredible educators in so many different ways. I mean, I was so lucky to have so many amazing mentor teachers. And you get an opportunity to really try things out. One of my stories, going global, is I was coming from a school here in the US where we were 99% free and reduced lunch. We were very low income school, struggling, kids not reading, writing, or doing math at grade level, let alone above grade level. And my wife and I take this job in Saudi Arabia, and I'll never forget this. We got done with the first week of school, and I came home and I looked at my wife and I was like, I'm in trouble. And she's like, why? And I was like, because we just finished a whole month's worth of lesson plans in a week. I don't know if I know how to engage this type of learner. And it's just such a different, I mean, you were talking for the most part, not every child, of course, but for the most part, you were talking families who are highly educated with students and communities who really believe in education, believe in the educational process.
Yes.
So you have kids that are committed. And we covered a month's worth of, and I was pushed as a teacher to be better. And that's the thing that I remember, and being surrounded by other educators and the professional learning that you can do, the networks that you create with others. One of the things we talk about all the times is technology allows you to break down the four walls of a classroom. You both know this, you only have to be international for 2 years. And next thing you know, you have friends who are living in Vietnam and Singapore and Hong Kong. And you break down the classroom walls because you can just quote unquote Zoom one of your friends in some other country because we happen to be talking about the Middle East. Let's go visit a classroom in the Middle East. Let's go visit a classroom in China that the kids actually get to go climb on the Great Wall. It opens up a world of just not only for you, but for every student that you ever teach. You have a new network to create these kids in incredible ways. And that is something that I still to this day, don't take for granted. I remember just a quick story to just kind of put this, my wife and I moved back here to the States. I was doing consulting work with a small little rural school district here in the state of Washington, and they were studying the Middle East. And I just so happened to still have a contact at the International School of Riyadh. The assistant superintendent Skyped in, or this was Google on air at the time, but basically Skyped into these kids in the middle of Washington State and to just watch their high school kids who get to talk to somebody who lives in Saudi Arabia, not just read about it in the textbook. And those are the kind of opportunities we all have that regardless of where you live, you have that now. But when you're an international educator, you have those personal connections that it's a quick email or it's a quick tweet or, and next thing you know, you truly have connected your kids. So there's just so many incredible ways that it opens up, avenues for you, both personally and professionally. And again, impacts every child alive that you touch after.
Absolutely. The world is so flat.
So true.
So you really have such a handle on all of these different ways for teachers to engage their kids and expand their thinking beyond the classroom walls. If we were talking about pivoting from David was talking about teachers who are new to international education, if we were to talk about veteran international educators who are in the throes of designing their own professional and personal learning networks, are there some learning providers besides yourselves, of course, and other platforms that you might recommend to them?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so definitely check out Shifting Schools for sure. I think, for international educators, for all educators, but international educators, there's so many opportunities both within your, usually within your host country and within your networks. ECIS is doing some incredible stuff. Iracos is doing some incredible stuff. You've got these regional headquarters that I think are really starting to wrap their heads around how do we create community within that? A shout out and full disclosure, I sit on the board of the Learning2 conference. Learning2.org was a conference we started in 2007. They are now doing Pub PD again, where just for international educators. So you get a group of your friends, because you're at the American School of Budapest, and you go out to a pub and you all get on Twitter and you're answering questions and having conversations at the same time as international educators in Prague and Singapore and Hong Kong. And there's ways to create these networks. And I think if you're looking, if you really want to, there's no reason why not. I mean, the networks are out there. The programs are out there. You just have to figure out what do you want, and then go out and find it, because it's an incredible connected world. You can learn so much just by watching YouTube videos or subscribe to a bunch of podcasts. I mean, there are so many great educational podcasts that have come out in the last, since the pandemic. You guys, us, go type K-12 education into Spotify and you can and there's so many different ways to engage in it. And I think it's up to you to decide how you want to engage to it. But again, I'd be looking for your regional association, whether that's ECIS or, NISA, IRACOS. You guys probably have them all listed on your website for the different regions. Look for nonprofits like learning2.org. Full disclosure, I sit on the board, that are looking for ways of beyond just the going to the conference, which is great. I love going to the conference, and you should go to the conference. But there's all these other ways now in between to keep the community going. And find your community, find your people, and find a way to stay connected. And this idea of lifelong learning is here. How are you taking advantage of it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Could you just actually, one thing that we did, you mentioned some really helpful resources there, and we do have some on our site. So thank you. And also just a little plug, we would love our site to be as collaborative as possible. So Jeff, we welcome you to let us know if you have some other ones you think of that we can add up there. But you and I were talking before we started recording, and you said that one direction educators are going is Mastodon. Could you talk about that a little bit more too, please?
Yeah. So as we're recording this, nobody knows what's happening with Twitter. So
even Elon.
Yeah. There's a lot of educators that are just looking at what's different and what's out there. And Mastodon seems to be a place that educators are headed to, mastodon.education. And we'll make sure, I'm sure Audrey and David, you can make sure that's in the show notes. It's very Twitter-esque. It looks a lot like Twitter, only it's considered federated. In other words, it's not owned by anybody. No company owns it. You, the community, make up the rules. You, the community, are self-organizing. And it's incredible. And we're starting to get some momentum over there. And so you can join different servers. You can almost think of them, for lack of a better analogy, and it's a really, really bad analogy, they're like really big Facebook groups. But it's like Twitter. You hashtag things, you have conversations, there are replies, and toots, they call them TOOT instead of tweets, is what you do. So there's hashtag edutoots over there, and it's a place that people are going to. So if you are on Twitter a lot and you're thinking to yourself, I don't know what's going to happen to Twitter, or maybe you're just tired of all this quote unquote junk that's on Twitter today, you might head over there. And again, there's different servers for different things you're interested in. And so mastodon.education is a education specific server. That's all that you talk about there is education. You want to go talk about Lord of the Rings, you go find the Lord of the Rings server. And the cool thing is you can tie your servers together under one username, but you basically have, different ways of popping in and out of them. So it's a pretty cool place. I'm just getting set up in there. The other place that we've seen, and I think is still ready to grow. Are you ready for this one? TikTok. I really think TikTok's got some things going on. I have started doing TikToks. Shifting Schools has a lot of stuff on TikToks, AKA no dancing. Just to let everybody know, you don't have to worry about, there's no dancing yet.
Good.
But there's a lot of learning to be done over there. And not only is there a lot of learning professionally to be done over there, as educators, one of the things we talk a lot about at Shifting Schools is moving to understand student culture. And if you are a teacher of, I'm going to say 4th grade or above, you don't have to like TikTok, but you have to understand what TikTok is doing to this generation. You have to understand how much of their lives are wrapped up in sites like TikTok. You have to understand, and this is the one that blows my mind, TikTok is now more popular than Google worldwide. More people visit
Nice.
TikTok than any other website globally, number one. Number two, this generation uses TikTok as their number one search engine. Now, I don't, but I was raised in a text-based world. I'm not a media first brain. And so we, as educators, we chose a job to educate the next generation. We have to understand what is going on in those spaces. And I think there's some potential over there. I've only been saying that for about 8 months. So I'm still trying to figure out what the potential is, but I think there's some things over there that we need to also just be playing with and keep our eye on.
And when you talk about engagement, I mean, that is a time vacuum, that thing, right? It's engaging. People
so
want to see
engaging.
more. Yeah, absolutely.
Quick snippets. And what are we learning
Yeah.
about learners today? Quick
Right.
video snippets.
Absolutely.
And you wonder why, when you try to stand up and give a 45-minute lecture on World War II, you can't keep their attention.
Go
Right?
figure.
Quick video snippets.
Yeah.
For better or for worse. I'm not saying it's right. I'm telling you the brain that's in front of your
But
classroom.
it's where they're at. It's where
It's
they're
where they're
at.
at.
No, that's a really, really helpful insight. Thank you for that.
Definitely. So, Jeff, I've got to go into the Wayback Machine to 2007 and our driving question. Yeah. The biggie of how do international schools shift to genuine teaching communities of innovative practices? And I know that's a massive question. You've covered several ways to get there, but I'm just wondering, is there something else you would want to add to that?
I think the last thing, and this is something that I'm constantly working on right now and I'm thinking about, so get ready for, and David, you're pretty used to this, a half-formed rant idea that I don't really know where it goes. So prepare yourself for this.
Okay.
But we over on Shifting Schools podcast, episode 187, we actually talked with Steve Barkley, who helps schools around the idea of professional learning communities. And he said something to me that really resonated. And he said, what has happened over the last 5-6 years in all schools is that we've moved away from this idea of PLCs. PLCs were huge. You remember, like, when the whole PLC movement came in? PLCs are huge, and we still have PLCs in schools, but he was talking about the work that he was doing. And one of the things that he's seen is that over time, these PLCs have transformed into PWCs. So instead of being, professional learning communities, they're professional working communities. And what we've seen, and I experienced this at my last 2 international schools, is we had PLC time where it was supposed to be professional learning communities, where we were supposed to be learning together as professionals. But over time, that idea has gotten lost with this idea that it becomes work time. A lot of times now we use this idea of, I'm meeting with my PLC. What we really mean is I'm meeting with my grade level team. I'm meeting with my department. And so it becomes a work session. It becomes a, what are we doing next? Or who's got the test? Or it becomes a work session because we have to fill out this form from the administration. And we've eroded that community aspect that really was supposed to be professional learning communities. So what I'm really wrestling with, and again, half-baked idea here, how do we get back to this idea of professional learning communities in the world of 2022, 2023, where we know we have access to resources? And so one of the things we're playing with over at Shifting Schools is this idea of podcast PD. So a couple things we know about podcasts. You can get them anywhere. And number 2, and I've been saying this for more years than I would wish I had been, but we know this when it comes to learning. If you get on the phone, you win. And podcasts are the best thing on a phone. You can download this through Apple or Google or Spotify, like name your avenue. It doesn't matter. So what if there is something here around podcasting where my PLC, right, my professional learning community and I say, we're all going to listen to episode, whatever episode number this is, episode 23 of the podcast. And then when we get together face to face, we're going to talk about what were some of the things we learned or some of the things we found interesting. Over at Shifting Schools, we've even already come up with protocols that you can use so that as you're listening, you can be jotting down notes around based on protocols. When you get back to your team meeting, you get back to your professional learning community, you can all engage in a deeper conversation around something that you learned. And I think there's this need to get back to how do we get back to this idea of professional learning communities. And again, it doesn't have, I use podcasts because we're really focused on the podcast PD thing, but it could be around a TED Talk. What if we all, and you don't have to be in the same room to watch the TED Talk. We start teaching teachers like professional. Audrey, you've got 10 minutes. Go watch the TED Talk on your lunchtime. David, you've got basketball practice after school. Great. You're going to watch it at 7:00 tonight. And, I'm a morning person. I watch it at 6:30 in the morning. It doesn't matter when I watch the TED Talk. What matters is I'm prepared when I come together with my community. I'm ready to have deep conversations around learning. And how does this move us forward as a professional learning community? How does this move us forward as a school? How does this move us forward as a grade level team? How does this move us forward and get back to that idea? The resources are out there. How do we kind of meld these together and move away from what I have seen happen is we become professional working communities and get back to this idea of professional learning communities? And so I think there's some work to be done there. In international schools, I'm hearing that this is an issue as well as we've gotten into the work and we're not giving ourselves time to truly be in really good, really collaborative professional learning communities. That's an idea. Still working on it.
I like it.
Yeah, I'm on board. Sign me up. No, and really, teachers, by and large, are lifelong learners. We love to learn. And so put us in an environment where, we can learn from each other. And I love this book club type of setup that you're thinking about here, because it's sharing ideas among each other. It's many heads are better than one, and it's collaborative, it's fun, it's engaging, and I'm on board. Let's do it. Sign me up. All right. So as we start to wrap up here, we're shifting maybe a little bit back to what are you hearing? You're working a lot now with people in US schools, Canadian schools. One of the things we're thinking about is teachers are leaving the classroom in unprecedented numbers. What are you hearing regarding teacher morale and how they're feeling about continuing with teaching?
Yeah, such a great question. Teaching morale is down. Teachers are overworked. And I think here in the US and Canada, as the thoughts and ideas of a recession coming around, that's only going to get worse. With a recession means less money. As you know, public education is funded by local levies and tax dollars and state funds. And so as soon as all of that goes down, there's less money comes to schools. Less money means less resources, means less teachers. And so it's going to be a rough couple of years. That's step one that we're seeing impacting education right now. The second part that we're seeing impact education here, specifically in the US, is education has become political once again. And the nice thing I think about, being a veteran teacher, this isn't the first time education's been politicized in the US. It happens. Almost as much as stocks go up and down, I feel like education has its time. We haven't had a quote unquote educational focused president now for a while. We know we were in a horrible recession in 2008. So it was all about the economy, the economy, the economy. And we're still about the economy. And with another recession coming around the corner, education is kind of going away and then it becomes politicized. And when it becomes politicized, it just takes a beating, and that's a beating on the educational system. That's beating on teachers. That's beating on principals and superintendents, and nobody can do anything right. And regardless of what your political spectrum is, it's just getting nailed right now. And so we've got to get through that. And so there's just a lot of really, I think, things hitting education hard right now. And it's tough to be a teacher. it's tough to be a teacher in the US right now. I feel for teachers in the classroom. They're gritting it out. They're making do with what they have. But at the end of the day, our job is to prepare kids for their future and not our past. And we are doing that to the best of our ability. And I salute, every teacher who every day is doing it. And I don't hold it against teachers that met their breaking point.
Right.
During the pandemic, I was lucky enough through shifting schools. We supported over 22,000 educators across the state of Washington for almost 2 years in trying to understand how do you pivot into online learning. As a state here, we were basically completely closed down March to June, so a year and 4 months. And it took a toll on a lot of people on a lot of different ways. And there's just a lot going on right now. So we're sticking it out. We're going through the trenches, but you know what? This is not the first time education has done this, and it won't be the last. So we do what we can. We fight the good fight. We do what we know is best for kids, and do our best to let the things that you cannot control slide off your back and focus on your kids for a little bit. But
grant me the serenity to,
yes,
yeah,
exactly.
accept the things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just listening to you, as I said before, it's really energizing. And I think that there's a couple of things that we could look at for teachers who are starting to feel less energized. One, get over to shifting schools and re-energize your teaching practice, for one thing. And then, another possibility, part of the reason for the podcast that we're doing here is to interest people in this idea of going international, because international schools tend to have that much more kind of control on what's going on. Typically, they have a bit more parental buy-in to education and student respective teachers. And then you get the travel as well, side bonus, So
Yeah.
these are some possible ways that people who are starting to feel discouraged can maybe look to more interesting future. So thank you so much for those ideas.
Yeah. Well, and I think the international schools are in a really interesting place now too. I'm hearing from multiple friends who are still in the international world, and I'm sure the two of you are too. This is a big year for recruiting. It sounds like there are job openings everywhere as kind of, people can finally feel like they could leave. Maybe they stayed, they were ready to only stay one more place in Ethiopia. And next thing you know, you're there for 3 more years and you kind of had your mindset that you're going to get out and you couldn't. So we're seeing a lot of transition in international schools this year too, which is going to be really interesting, I think, for international schools when maybe you could be turning over 60, 70% of your staff. I'm really interested about what's going to happen with schools in China. It really concerns me. Those teachers have been, in the trenches for a long time. And we know that a lot of them are now looking to leave. And are there going to be teachers willing to move into China? At the same time, if you were a teacher in the US or Canada or Australia, and you're looking to go somewhere different and unique experience, China could be a great in for you. So I don't know. I think it's just going to be really globally. I think it's going to be a really interesting a couple years here as everything kind of, the floodgates open up and we all kind of retransition back to whatever the new normal happens to be.
And we're hoping to bring on some people that have their fingers on the pulse of especially what's happening in China. You really nailed it there, because people have been in incredible lockdowns for years now, and we're seeing if there's going to be a change in policy. And I think you bring up an interesting point. If you go to the discussion boards, you just sadly see a lot of people that are worn out. But this can be an opportunity for people that want to get a job at Shanghai American or International School of Beijing, that you thought you might never be able to get up to that high level of the hierarchy. So there are opportunities when things go pretty bad sometimes. So we'll see what happens with that. Now, Jeff, we've thrown some big questions at you, and you've been incredible as usual, being able to take them on and give us your thoughts. So we're just wondering, is there anything else you wanted to add before we finish up the episode?
No, I think that about covers it. I appreciate it being, I love the questions. I love being made to think about them and trying my best to articulate my thinking. It's such a good exercise in itself. And so I appreciate you for giving me the opportunity to reflect out loud with you and to learn with you. And David, it's always great to reconnect with you. Audrey, it's great to hear your stories and always to connect with another international educator.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you both for having me on and allowing me to, I don't know, rant a little bit.
Well, along those lines of ranting and thinking out loud, please tell our listeners how they can follow you if they want to hear more about what you're thinking.
Yeah, you can follow us. Everything we do at Shifting Schools is at shiftingschools.com. The independent consulting that I do, you can either link from there or you go to jeffutecht.com. You can follow me everywhere on social medias, from YouTube to TikTok. It's all at Utecht. I've only had to pay one teenager to make sure I had the at Utecht username, so I've been pretty lucky that way. No, it's been good. So at Utecht everywhere, over on mastodon.education, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, you name it, at Utecht. So you can follow there. And then Shifting Schools everywhere as well. So we're either Shifting Schools or Shifting School Pod. Shifting Schools on Twitter. Again, my colleague Trisha, who can be here today, a big shout out to her. She is constantly making free guides. One thing I would recommend everybody do is go over to shiftingschools.com, download one of the free guides. You have to give us your email. We do that for two reasons. One, we email you the free PDF so that it's in your inbox, because we find teachers all the time contact us back and say, hey, I downloaded this and I don't know where it went. It's very easy for us to say, like, go search your inbox. It came through you for an email. So it's always there because everybody lives in their inboxes nowadays. And the second thing is it signs you up for our newsletter. And every Wednesday, Trisha writes a new newsletter. And almost every Wednesday, there's a free PDF with more protocols and more, I don't know, things for you to do with your kids. Ready to roll resources is what we call them. She loves creating those. And you can always reach out to us at info@Shifting Schools if you're like, I would really love a resource for X to work with Y students. And we do our best. That's where all those resources have come from, is from teachers reaching out and saying, hey, I could really use a resource on this, this, and this. Or, hey, we just had a teacher reach out and said, we're really struggling with our social media at our school. Could you do some podcast episodes around social media? And so we got, actually, it was all international schools, marketing and communications directors who came on and did a kind of a panel discussion. And then we interviewed some people in social media marketing, all with how do you support schools in social media. So we're trying our best, just like you, to answer the needs of our listeners and the people that support us. So yeah, shiftingschools.com, jeffutecht.com. And from there, you can find us everywhere on the internet.
Excellent.
And look for future dancing videos of Jeff on TikTok, right, Jeff?
Yeah.
We'll see.
Wait, was that the guy, the Jeff dancing around the world? Was that you? Wasn't his name
right.
Jeff?
Yeah, that was a different Jeff. Yeah.
Where is Jeff? Yeah.
Oh my. Well, Jeff, on a very personal level, I sit here and my brain is shifting backwards to the days when I was able to sit with virtually you and Mark Hofer and bounce questions off each of you, and then you would share, and then you would riff on what the other person was saying. And those were very special days in my life. And it's wonderful to have you come on. And, in a certain time in the future, we'll have you come back on as we go forward in our endeavor. So thanks again, my friend.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being a part of my learning network for, going on whatever it is, 15 years now. I've learned so much from you, David, and I can't say thank you enough for all your support and just being a colleague and a mentor along the way.
Cheers. Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
and David
inviting you to travel,
teach,
and connect with us.